am Dr. David Perlmutter. Welcome again to the Empowering Neurologist. For most people here in America, adults, weight loss is a goal. And, people may be on what they think is the right diet and exercising and doing all the right things, but still cannot seem to lose weight. Well, it turns out that there may be some environmental issues here that we've not considered. There are chemicals that have been called obesogens that are in our environment that actually can convince your body that the right thing to do is to make body fat and to store body fat. We'll be looking at this book today called The Obesogen Effect, written by Dr. Bruce Blumberg. Dr. Blumberg has been conducting pioneering research in the field of human biology for more than 30 years. He is professor in the departments of developmental and cell biology and pharmaceutical sciences and biomedical engineering at the University of California at Irvine. At UCI, his laboratory studies the biology of nuclear hormone receptors, and we'll talk about what that means, in development and physiology and disease, with a particular emphasis on how these receptors are affected by what are called hormonally active compounds in the diet and also those that are in our environment. He is actually the one credited with beginning or creating the term obesogens and proposing this so-called obesogen hypothesis, holding that various toxins in our environment that we are exposed to disrupt our hormonal system and may be an important factor predisposing us to weight gain, again, even when we're eating in a way that we feel is totally appropriate. His laboratory has recently demonstrated that the effects of maternal obesogen exposure may be passed on to future generations as far as 4 generations out. Now, we'll be looking at that laboratory study in just a little bit. Let me just tell you a little bit more about Dr. Blumberg. He's a graduate of Rutgers in 1976. That's the year I graduated from college as well. He earned his PhD in biology from UCLA in 1987 and went on to make various high-profile discoveries. He's been working at the Gene Expression Laboratory at the Salk Institute for Biological Sciences in La Jolla, and he has published more than 125 peer-reviewed research papers. So I'm excited to jump into this interview. Here we go. Well, welcome, Dr. Blumberg. Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
I want to just jump right in. In the intro, I was talking about how people might be doing everything they think is right in terms of exercise and certainly diet, and yet, the statistics with respect to overweight and obesity in Western cultures is really quite staggering. You have a terrific book, The Obesogen Effect, and you are calling attention to the fact that there may be an environmental issue here. So can you walk us through this?
So the research that we started probably 11, 12 years ago now, and has been picked up also by other people in the world, shows that there are chemicals in the environment that can alter our metabolism that can lead to a predisposition to gain weight. So for example, if we expose pregnant mice to a very low dose of a chemical that we're all exposed to called tributyltin, the babies will get fat, and so will the next 3 generations, now, even eating a normal diet.
These changes take place because of the effects of the chemicals, presumably on metabolism and endocrine function. Can you go through a little bit more specifically about what is going on with various chemicals and how they're leading to obesity?
Well, it depends on the chemical. So the one that we work on acts on 2 hormone receptors. And these 2 receptors work together, and the names are PPAR gamma and RXR. And these receptors control the development of fat in your body and the function of fat cells. So if you express these receptors in a stem cell, that stem cell is now predisposed to become a fat cell. And if you activate the receptor, then it becomes a fat cell. And if you activate the receptor in a fat cell, it stores more fat than it would otherwise. So it's a very key player in the whole process of the development of fat.
So there's a lot going on. I don't mean to be too technical with respect to the PPAR gamma receptor, not just in terms of lipogenesis, but also inflammation as well.
Absolutely. It also has an effect on inflammation. And we know that one of the characteristics of fat in obese people is that it's inflamed.
Now, you mentioned how activation of these receptors then goes on to make the fat cells, make them more numerous and actually allow those fat cells to retain more fat?
That's correct. So our most recent experiments showed that when we treated pregnant mice with the same very low dose of tributyl and then looked 4 generations later, so in human terms, the great-great-grandchildren of the exposed mother, those animals responded differently to diet. So they were a little bit fatter on their own, and when we challenged them with a slightly higher fat diet, only 20% of calories from fat, they got obese very fast.
Wow.
Interestingly, when we fasted them, when we took away the food, they kept the fat. So it's every dieter's lament. I eat the same thing as Dr. Perlmutter, but I get fat and he doesn't.
No, I wouldn't say that's likely. But
when I don't eat, I don't lose the weight.
Yeah.
So that's exactly the situation we've created in the mice by exposing them to this chemical.
Yeah, and this is a relatively new experience for humans to have our these various receptors and gene pathways be affected epigenetically for the first time in our history on this planet.
We're detecting it for the first time. I expect it's been going on for, probably since the Second World War after the chemical revolution, and we started putting lots of chemicals into the environment that had never been there before.
Yeah, again, in our history on the planet, a blink of an eye. Let me go back just to a moment ago when you talked about fat cells, because you brought up a very interesting point in the book, and that is that many of us have the notion that we have a finite number of fat cells when we develop them, that they're going to remain with us for the rest of our lives, that number. But your book tells a different story that I think is kind of novel.
Right. So it was once thought that we're born with all the fat cells we'll ever have. We're born with any kind of cells that we'll ever have. But that's not strictly true. So with respect to fat cells, the average fat cell in your body lives for 10 years. So your fat cells turn over. That is, they're created and destroyed about 10% a year. The other interesting thing is that your body knows from programming early in life how many fat cells it's supposed to have, and it will defend that number. So if you take an obese person and you liposuction away a lot of those fat cells, the body will put them back, not necessarily in the same place that they were.
It's truly breathtaking that your body knows.
Yeah, and we don't know how it knows. The other thing is we don't know how the body knows when to increase that number. So the number can be increased, but I don't know of any examples where the number is decreased. And that would be nice to know that we could reduce the number a bit.
I bet you'll figure it out. But that said, you talk about how you can be drinking good water, eating sustainably harvested fish, eating your vegetables every day, and yet this may be a risk because of exposure. Tell us about that.
Well, the risk is that let's get back to the concept of metabolic programming. So your metabolism is programmed early in your life up until about the end of puberty to respond a certain way to calories. So for example, if you expose a baby to famine when his mother is still pregnant, and we know this from unfortunate human studies in the Second World War, where the famous Dutch famine study, where people were starved. The occupying Nazi army cut off food to Amsterdam and the surrounding area, and people didn't have anything to eat. And the babies who survived, who were exposed to famine, then became obese later in life. So this early life experience programs how your body will respond for the rest of your life. So what we believe is happening is the chemicals exposure at an early stage of development has altered how the animals respond to calories. And we can measure that very precisely in mice because they're genetically identical. We have one group we don't expose, one group we expose, give them the same diet, the same access to exercise, and the exposed group gets fat and the unexposed group doesn't. Obviously, you can't do that kind of experiment in humans, but you can make links between levels of chemicals and obesity or diabetes in humans.
And when you make these links and demonstrate the effects on the intervention group versus the control group, obviously there is some way to control for any changes that happened in the microbiome?
That's not something we can easily control for, but the animals live in the same environment. right? They're housed in the same type of cages with the same sort of bedding. They eat the same food. They start out the same. So the microbiome could have changed during their life. That's an area of active investigation. So based on a lot of work from Jeff Gordon's lab and Peter Turnbaugh's lab, there's ample evidence that altering the microbiome can have effects on how an animal or a human utilizes calories, but it's not an area that we've investigated much yet.
Mm-hmm. Let me go back to the notion that there can be transgenerational effects of exposure to these obesogens. How does that work in the absence of the obesogen remaining present?
So that's one of the most interesting, exciting, and controversial aspects of this work and of other people's work. So what we can show is that if we expose the pregnant animals to low doses of this chemical, that the effects persist. And not just in the exposed offspring, but in the grandchildren, which were also exposed as germ cells inside the exposed embryo. But by the third generation, they were not exposed to the chemical any longer. So if you see an effect, you have to be able to explain why that happened. And there's really only two ways. One is that you caused a genetic mutation, and that mutation somehow was propagated, or that you've changed the epigenome, you changed the epigenetics of the animal that causes the effect to persist. We believe, and others believe, that we've caused epigenetic changes. And our most recent paper shows that we changed the structure, the three-dimensional structure of DNA inside the nucleus. We're getting a little technical here, but if you imagine that the DNA in the nucleus is like a bowl of spaghetti. But that spaghetti has structure. There are parts that always occur next to other parts. And there are loops that always involve certain genes. And when you alter that structure, you alter the function of those genes. So what we believe is that the exposure to the endocrine disruptor has altered the structure, and that altered structure is propagated down the generations.
Do you foresee a time in the future when we fully or have a much better grasp of what these epigenetic changes may be, to the extent that we might be able to actually intervene?
That's, of course, the dream, right? That we understand the process and that we can then manipulate it to get the outcome that we desire. In this case, to not get fat when you're exposed to dietary excess, right? I mean, everyone's dream would be to eat as many donuts as you want and not get obese, or at least to eat a normal diet and not get obese. And it would be nice if we could program that in some way. And I do foresee that may be in the not so distant future.
Well, I would say that to our viewers, if you think back of some of the interviews we've done recently that relate to being on a ketogenic diet, or as Dr. Walter Longo talked about, a fasting mimicking diet, that there are some issues with respect to gene expression that seem to be favorably influenced by diet, that even at this early stage of our understanding of epigenetics might be something we could consider. I also want to tell our viewers that we're going to get to the part in this interview today about what we should be doing, the bright side. So that's what the book is all about. Well, let's stay with the problem, and then we'll hit the solution in a minute. You call our attention to cosmetics, to lipstick, to foods, to various ways that we store food in the refrigerator. Let's walk through some of the big players that represent obesogenic risk.
Well, one of the insidious things about obesogens and also endocrine disruptors in general is that we willingly expose ourselves to these chemicals. Many preservatives in personal care products, parabens. It's difficult to find any personal care product that doesn't have parabens or phthalates in them. It's possible, but you have to work hard at it. These are endocrine disruptors and obesogens that we willingly, put in our hair, on our bodies. So there are many, many instances where we're exposed to these chemicals in our daily life. So
the air fresheners that are in the Uber car that you get into, the new mattress smell, the new car smell, the plasticware that people put their food in to go into the refrigerator and maybe even microwave thereafter, these all are potential risks.
These all carry endocrine disrupting and obesogenic chemicals, and they pose some degree of risk.
So again, you're doing your darndest to lose weight. You're on whatever diet, low carb hopefully, and higher fat, higher protein, exercising regularly, and yet this problem is pervasive in terms of Western cultures. And your thesis is really one that is, well explains this because of the way that these disruptors are so pervasive as well.
Yeah, so the message that I want to convey is that the exposure to endocrine disrupting and obesogenic chemicals has changed the way your body responds to many things, including your diet. And that if you've been exposed, or your mom or your grandmom, or sometime in your life history have been exposed, that doesn't say you're doomed to become fat. What it means is that you're doomed to have to work harder than someone else who hasn't been exposed. And we well know the example of people responding differently to various kinds of medicines. And one of my messages is that to all the physicians who accept the concept of personalized medicine, that I may respond differently to a drug than you do or than someone else does, it's the same exact situation with chemicals in the environment and with food. We're all individuals. We respond differently. What works for me may not work for someone else.
Well, there is this big, I think, dichotomy between the broad strokes of general recommendation and the notion of a personalized medical approach to the individual. But I think the broad strokes you well describe in your book that I think are things that would work for everybody. What should we be doing?
We should do our best to reduce exposure, do our best to eat fresh whole foods, do our best to live in an environment that's not stressful, that's not noisy, that's dark for you to sleep at night. There are a whole host of factors that I cover in the book that no matter what your physiology, you're better off not exposing yourself to.
So we've got a bunch of hormones that are controlling things like the generation of fat, the breakdown of fat, our appetite, etc. I think many of our viewers are pretty savvy in terms of understanding things like ghrelin and leptin and insulin, for example. Right. How are these commonly understood hormones affected at all by these exogenous toxic obesogens?
So interesting that you asked that. So in our mice that get fat, the F4 generation mice that get fat when they're exposed to a higher fat diet, those animals are leptin resistant. So the ancestral exposure has led to overexpression of the leptin gene in these animals. So that means they don't ever sense satiety because they're resistant to the satiety signal. So, and that's the one very strong example we have. The leptin pathway is disrupted by exposure to this chemical. I wouldn't say that's the only effect, but that's certainly a very noticeable effect.
We had on the program Dr. Robert Lustig and Gary Taubes as well, both of whom talked about basically leptin resistance and how our bodies really ultimately lose our connection with the notion of being full, of eating enough and knowing when to push away from the table. And now even if you're avoiding sugars and artificial sweeteners, yet these chemicals in our environment seem to be triggering these pathways, and at least based upon your animal work.
Yes, and I think that it's quite likely that the effect will be the same in humans. You can't do those experiments, obviously, but what you can do is look for changes that happen in animals and ask the question, do I see those in people? Can I make a logical connection there? Because obviously we don't want to do, nor could we do, even if we wanted to, kind of controlled exposure experiments on humans. You just wouldn't do that.
Plastic is everywhere. Everywhere we turn, on land or in the seas, we are encountering plastic. And, I think clearly that's got to be one of the big players here in terms of multiple entrances into these threatening pathways. What are we to do?
Getting the plastic out of your life to the best of your ability is very high on the list, I would say.
How do we make that happen?
The easiest way is to change how you live. So, for example, you won't find any plastic containers in my home. We have glass, stainless steel, porcelain. You simply won't find any plastic.
So then we're all moving in with you, it sounds like. Was that the solution?
I mean, it's not so difficult to do that. Can you eliminate it 100%? That's pretty difficult.
I mean,
And
you
if
get into your car, and on a hot day, you know
yeah,
things are outgassing. You
sure.
actually did some work and talk about other environmental factors that can, I think, exacerbate what happens with these chemical exposures. Things like light, noise, other types of
hmm
stress. How do those things factor into this equation?
So we know we know a fair amount about how disruption of circadian rhythms by light and noise pollution, how these things are associated with obesity and a whole host of other adverse consequences. What we don't know yet is the degree to which those interact with obesogen exposure. You might reasonably predict that there would be an interaction, but simply that's not being studied by anyone to my knowledge. So that's a whole new frontier.
Let me get back, if I could, to the microbiome for just a moment. Is there a direct effect? Are you studying, or is somebody looking at the direct effect of these chemicals on the microbiome, at least in laboratory animals?
To my knowledge, most people are not looking on that. We've done some preliminary work and looked at the microbiome in our ancestrally exposed animals, and it's different to some degree. Now, to what extent those differences are related to the effect is an open question. We see differences, and those need to be investigated.
The receptors that these ubiquitous chemicals in our environment are binding to and then causing these downstream effects, can you just really explain and make it clear that these are normal receptors that are there to otherwise do, normal things in our physiology?
Absolutely. So the hormone receptors in your body, as you well know, are there to help regulate function. So there's this idea of homeostasis. For example, hormones regulate homeostasis. They regulate the natural balance of the body. That's in adults. During development, they may have a very different function. Right? They might not be regulating homeostasis. They might regulate the development of the organs themselves. And the effects that you cause during development are called organizational effects, and those are permanent. Those are not reversible. The kinds of effects that you get when you disrupt a hormonal signaling pathway in a human will reverse when you take it away. A good example would be birth control pills. So when a woman takes birth control pills, she doesn't get pregnant, her menstrual cycling changes, and when she stops taking the pills after some period of time, it will normalize.
There was a Walt Disney film called The Sorcerer's Apprentice,
Yes,
where
I remember.
Gets, I think was it Mickey Mouse, I think, gets in real trouble. And, I just feel like with the creation of these 10,000 new chemicals annually, about which we have very, very little data, what are we doing? And beyond that, what are we expecting in terms of these small effects on humans? I think one of the biggest experiments, I know I'm going to go off topic here, is the glyphosate experiment. This ubiquitous exposure that we have now to this herbicide that is being used globally in terms of metric tonnage, the long-term consequences of which are unknown. The World Health Organization characterizing it as a probable human carcinogen, but its effects upon receptors, I think, is unknown. Its effects on the human microbiome also unknown. Is there any discussion in your laboratory or amongst your colleagues with reference to glyphosate?
So among my colleagues, yes. So I participate in some of these discussions, and I've been on scientific advisory boards. In my laboratory, we're busy enough working on the chemical that we work on, or the few chemicals, so glyphosate is not one of them. I leave that to others. But definitely being exposed to relatively high doses of all of these kinds of chemicals, glyphosate is one of them, is unlikely to be beneficial. I mean, you can argue about the degree to which it's harmful, and there's many people who think it's quite harmful, and there's a whole industry camp thinks it's safer than salt. But one thing that no one can argue is that there's any benefit from exposure. So if there's no benefit and there's some risk, whether it's a little risk or a lot of risk, the smart course of action is to not be exposed.
Well, that might be the smart course of action, but unfortunately that doesn't always win out. I mean, there are those who would indicate, for example, as it relates to glyphosate, that this is the way we can feed the world. I think it'd be a fair bet to say that you would support buying organic food whenever available.
Absolutely.
And the chemicals that you are most involved in terms of research, could you just tell us again what they are and where we're going to find them, where we would find our exposures?
So the chemical, the model obesogen that we study because we know a lot about it is called tributyltin. It's found in plastics. It's not intentionally put there, so it's found in all kinds of vinyl plastics as a contaminant of the chemical that is put there intentionally, which is called dibutyltin. So it has two butyl groups, and tributyltin has three. Dibutyltin is there as a heat stabilizer in the making of the plastic. So vinyl plastics have it. So all the vinyl plastics in your home crumble and they make little bits of dust. So there's a guy in New York, Professor Kanan, who's measured in-house. He goes and vacuums dust up in people's houses and measures the chemicals in there. And organotins like tributyltin are there. So we are exposed at significant amounts to these chemicals.
Now, all of these things that people use in their homes to make their houses smell good and clean the floors and it leaves a nice fresh scent, those are suspect as well.
Many of the, so phthalates are certainly known obesogens, both in animals, and there's epidemiological evidence from humans showing that higher phthalate levels correspond to higher fat levels, for example. The other kinds of chemicals that we work a lot on are fungicides. So tributyltin actually was intended to kill fungus and also used in ship hulls. So it was painted on the bottom of ship hulls so that all kinds of marine organisms wouldn't grow there. So you can imagine if you have a boat or a ship and the hull is all covered with stuff, it doesn't go through the water as fast. You need to burn more gas. So for your sailboat, maybe that's not a big problem, but if you have a big freighter going across the ocean, that's a huge problem. So tributyltin was used on the hulls of those to replace copper, which was extraordinarily toxic. I keep reef tanks, and copper kills everything. So tributyltin was a big benefit. It didn't kill everything, but it caused these other effects. It changed the sex of snails. It changes the sex of fishes. It turns out that it makes people fat, among other consequences. So tributyltin was used as a fungicide in paints in addition to that. And it turns out that in testing chemicals for the National Toxicology Program, we found out a whole variety of other fungicides are also potential obesogens.
Now, Dr. Blumberg, obviously reduction in rates of male fertility have been ascribed to these types of chemicals as well. And again, I know this is a bit off topic from the obesity story, but we are seeing reports of lower and lower sperm counts in males. What's this connection?
So the connection is not so much with obesogens, but with endocrine disruptors, with chemicals that primarily disrupt the androgen receptor, the testosterone receptor. And my late colleague Lou Gillette famously said in Congress, probably more than 10 years ago, he said to a senator who was questioning him, he said, "Senator, you and every other man in this room are half the man your grandfather was," talking about sperm counts. The sperm counts have been on the decline for quite a while. Now, I suppose you could take the position that the population of the world is already too large, and maybe that's not a bad thing, but disrupting the way biology works is never a good thing.
Wow. Well, this is really interesting stuff, and I would just want our viewers to note that there's a lot of, we sort of just touched upon getting the plastics out of our house and moving in with you. But beyond that, I thought at the end of your book, it's very actionable. A lot of interesting things that I hadn't thought about, which I think are going to turn out to be very, very important. You can't bury your head in the sand because likely the sand is contaminated. But I mean, I think this is something that being aware of for those of our viewers who haven't really heard of this, but for those who are, Rachel Carson devotees, this will be the next logical step. So thank you so much for joining us today. This is really fascinating information. I'm hoping in a year or two we can touch bases again and follow up with what you've learned.
Well, I hope so. We have big plans to dig into this subject much more, and if the funding agencies cooperate, we'll be there.
Oh, okay. We'll hope for the best on that one. Thanks again.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Well, what did you think of that? That's really interesting information, especially for those of you who are struggling to lose weight despite doing everything that you think you should be doing in terms of diet and exercise. What we learned from Dr. Blumberg is there's a lot of stuff out there that has an effect on your receptors, on your cells, that may be convincing your body that it needs to make fat and hold on to fat. As you'll recall, we even explored the notion that the changes that take place maternally might well be passed on for several generations to come. We also looked at the interesting effect of these so-called obesogens on our microbiomes, a collection of organisms living within us and upon us. So again, here is the book, The Obesogen Effect, a very interesting read, and I think you'll find it very fascinating. Thanks again for joining us on the Empowering Neurologist. I am Dr. David Perlmutter. Bye for now.